switch gears and we'll start. And I see Donna Brothers, she's jumped on. And Donna, so glad to have you on. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, Christina. Thanks for asking me. And I always love listening to Mike Welsh's insights. He's done this for so many years, and he really does have a good eye. He has a horseman's eye for watching the horses work, as you well know, or you wouldn't have had him on.
We've actually had him on several times, and I'm actually fortunate that I can say that he's actually a good friend of mine as well. So we always love having him on. He's fabulous, and he really does have a good eye for that. But now we have you on. We've never had you on before, so we're really excited about this. And Donna, maybe you might have missed this when I asked Mike this question initially in terms of his impression just being there this year, of course, versus last year. But just what are your impressions so far? Because how many derbies have you done so far? Can we even ask you that?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it's going to reveal that I'm old. The 2001 Kentucky Derby was the first year that NBC got the Derby. As you'll recall, ABC had the Derby before that, and I was there for that first one. So this is both the 20-year anniversary of covering the Kentucky Derby for me, NBC Sports, and Kenny Rice. Kenny Rice and I were the only two who were on that first show and every subsequent show. So hey, I'm lucky to still be hanging in here.
Yeah. Yeah, and I can say that I was definitely watching. I started watching at that point. In fact, I started a few years before. Let's just say that. But what has been the vibe this year? What have you sensed so far? I know we still have a week to go, but what has been the vibe so far?
Well, I mean, covering it for NBC Sports, you've got a guy like Mike Welsh who comes in and just like looks at the what do they call it, the X's and O's, and we look at the stories, and so I can tell you from our standpoint, there are some really, really good stories around it. I do look at the horses just as closely as Mike Welsh does. I'm not sure that I see all the same things that he sees. But I also love the stories, the good stories. And there's a lot of good stories going into this year's Oaks and Derby. In the Oaks, you've got John Court, who's 60 or 60 something years old. Wouldn't it be nice if he won the Kentucky Oaks on Will Secret for Dallas Stewart? And then in the Derby, all the good stories there. I mean, Steve Asmussen's parents have been in this. To give you a little history there, I think a lot of people don't realize that Steve is actually from South Dakota originally, and that's where he was born. And it was in South Dakota that his father, Keith Asmussen, went to work for a little known quarter horse trainer named Dwayne Lucas. You know the story, Christina. And then they went from there to Oklahoma. Keith Asmussen followed Wayne's stable to Oklahoma, and then Keith ended up setting up shop in Laredo, Texas, and he's been there ever since. And he's been breaking babies for the Winchells and a lot of the top owners all around the world, really, for years. And so he's broke, bred, sold all kinds of Grade 1 winners. But for this to be the very first Grade 1 winner for Keith and Marilyn Asmussen is pretty phenomenal. And by that I mean super stock for the people who don't know. Trained by Steve Asmussen. And then not only that, super stock gave Steve's son, Keith James Asmussen, his very first stakes win when he won the Texas Futurity. And so that's a great story. We're going to tell it a whole lot better on NBC. We'll do a feature story on him than I can tell here, because we'll get we've got a crew in Laredo, Texas now with Steve's parents. And so, yeah, we'll be able to bring it all together and tell that story, but it's a great story.
It is, and they're just such classy people. I think I met Keith probably now like 20 years ago when I went to my first sale, Keeneland September, just like so many years ago. So classy. There's just such nice people. I actually even met Cash Asmussen years ago. There's just such a classy group of people that it would be great to see them win. So I totally agree with you. But
yeah,
Donna, I'm sorry.
About that. When I was riding with the Bug in Birmingham, Alabama, I was riding for Steve Asmussen. That was his first year training horses, and it was my first year riding professionally. And so I would get on a lot of the horses, and then Keith Asmussen, Steve's father, would come in every now and then and ride some of the better ones. And so I said at the barn one day, because I was around the barn a lot, I always called him Mr. Asmussen, but now I'm riding with him. And so I said, I'm not really sure what to call you when we're out on the track. I'm like, if I'm, Mr. Asmussen, I'm down in here, I need out. And he's like, well, don't even bother hollering because I'm not going to let you out. we all go back to.
Yeah, nice, a good group of people. But so tell me a little bit, Donna, for those who might not know, how did you get started? Well, I think a lot of people do know that how you know your family connection. But tell us, for those of us who don't know, how did you get involved in horse racing? What was that progression for you to become a jockey?
Yeah, well, I can tell you, for those who don't know, it was not an original idea on my part. My mother was one of the first half dozen women to be licensed as a jockey. That was back in 1969. And by 1970, she was the leading female jockey in the United States. And that was this distinction that she held not only all throughout her career, she had a career ending injury in 1984 in a spill at what was Fairmount Park at the time in Illinois. Um, but it wasn't until 1988, 4 years after she was forced into retirement, that both Patty Cooksey and then Julie Crone later that same week finally passed her wins record. So she won, I want to say it was 1,201 races. And so, yeah, she won quite a lot for back then, right? And so my mother and my brother and my sister were all jockeys. And so if my mother tells the story, she often says she had 3 kids and one of them had no aspirations to be involved with horse racing or certainly to be a jockey, and that would be me. But I graduated from high school and my choices were college, which I really hadn't navigated very well. I did really well in high school, but I really was not focused on just getting to college right away. So I was going to take like what they call a gap year, right? Well, that gap year lasted for a long time. So I went to the track, went to what I knew, started galloping horses. And Christina, to be honest, it wasn't until then when I was galloping horses at the track that I realized that, you don't want to pat yourself on the back, but I didn't realize until then that I really did have a way with horses, that horses relaxed for me, that they ran for me, that I had a really good open line of communication with them. And the reason why I didn't know it until then is because my mother, brother, and sister were all phenomenal horsemen and women. And so around them, I wasn't even the best horse person in the family. So it wasn't until I got around other people that I realized, like, I think I'm actually pretty good at this. And so then when I was 21, I rode my first race. And the other thing that surprised me is that I actually thought it would be kind of easy. I mean, think about your own family nucleus and anything that your family's done, your mom, brother, and sister. I mean, how hard can it be, right? They all did it. And so I rode my first race and I realized, like, not only is this the most exciting thing I've ever done in my life, it's the most challenging thing I've ever done. And I didn't expect to be challenged that much by it. And so I just loved it. I had a passion. Like I said, I was 21 then. That was in 1987 in Birmingham, Alabama. And then I rode until 1998. I retired as the second leading female rider in the nation by money earned. And then fortunately, I got into doing the television coverage soon after that.
Well, before we leave the riding, you mentioned D. Wayne Lucas, and you rode some really nice horses for D. Wayne Lucas, and a couple of them that I know of was Boston Harbor. I think you also rode Golden Attraction. Was there anything that during your time that when you rode with Wayne that really stands out? Was there like a funny story or something that really stands out in terms of what you learned from Wayne or from the Wayne experience?
Yeah, there were, I mean, so many things. I mean, you've seen the pipeline of assistant trainers that have turned into top trainers that Wayne's created, but just a phenomenal horseman. I mean, everybody who's ever been around him has so much respect. He just sees all the little details. But one of the things that I remember, I asked him once about, he's got such a positive demeanor all the time, and not most horse trainers don't. As you know, most horse trainers are grumpy. And so I asked him one day, how do you stay so upbeat all the time? And he said, at that time, he had a lot of horses. And he said, Don, I've got 250 head of horses in training around the United States. He said, not only am I going to get bad news every day, I'm going to get bad news multiple times a day. And he said, I get to decide how I'm going to handle that. Am I going to let it take me down? Or am I going to stay upbeat and look for the next good thing? He said, I choose to stay upbeat and look for the next good thing. And like, what an amazing influence that was. It was like sort of a Vince Lombardi, coaching speech that was solicited by me. But I mean, he really did teach me the value of just look on the good side of things, because everybody can spend time dwelling on the bad side. And beyond that, just such a phenomenal horseman. I mean, the way that he was able to, I want to say one year when I was riding for him, I say we because I felt like I was a part of the team back in, I started riding for him in 1995. The first races I rode for him were in the fall of 1994, but then I rode for him through all of 95, 96, and throughout my rest of my career. Um, but I want to say one year we had 4 horses in the Kentucky Derby. It was Prince of Thieves, Thunder Gulch, Timber Country, and maybe it was Honor and Glory also that year. And his focus on all of those horses was as intense as if he had one horse in his barn that was in the Kentucky Derby, and he just a phenomenal horseman.
Mhm, mhm. I don't know if anybody has any questions for Donna. And again, as I said before, just feel free to either unmute yourself or just put the hand up feature, and then I'll get to you as soon as we have a natural break in the conversation. But okay, so we'll see. We'll just let everybody kind of come on and ask questions as we go along. But Donna, now since switching over into television, you started with television. You started pretty early on, it sounds like. I know you worked on the at the track with I think Churchill. You did Churchill. You've done Keeneland. You've worked for pretty much like several racetracks. You've worked for TVG. You've worked for a lot of different outlets. But if we talk about the NBC experience, when you started with NBC, what has been the progression in terms of media? What have you seen? How have you seen the telecast? Because now NBC's become like a award-winning, has won several awards for their coverage. So tell me a little bit, what have you seen in the progression in the last, let's say, 20 years since, or
Well,
at
the
least since
last
you've been
20
doing
years, I've worked for several different producers at NBC.
it?
The first one was David Michaels, better known to most people as Al Michaels' brother,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
he was my first producer at NBC. And then Sam Flood came in. Sam Flood is now executive producer. And then Fred Gaudelli came in for a little while. And Fred Gaudelli produces Sunday Night Football. And then Rob Hyland came in after Fred, or kind of with Fred, but then went up to the producer. And Rob Hyland is our producer for the Kentucky Derby telecast to this day. And so they all want things to be just a little bit different. And so back when we first started with David Michaels, and it's been a process for me, right? Because I feel like the analogy I give is like our broadcast is like this musical instrument that's happening, and our producer is what do you call the person? Conductor. Yeah,
The
the
conductor.
conductor.
Mhm.
And it was like they hired me because I could play the saxophone. And then we get 5 years into it, and the next producer's like, "That's great that you can play the saxophone, but I'm going to need you to play the trombone too. Can you do that?" "Sure, I can play the trombone." And now I'm playing drums also, right? It's just everybody wants something a little bit different. But when we first started, it was all very organic. Like we would just go out in the field and tell stories. So David Michaels would say, "Donna, I want you to go up to the jocks room and just tell me what you see happening." Now, if nothing was happening, you had to like kind of make it exciting. Most of the time there was something happening that was exciting. I remember one time I said, as you can see right over there, Ron Turcotte and Mike Smith talking. This was before Mike Smith had ever won a Derby. And I'm sure Mike Smith is trying to get some pointers from Ron Turcotte. And Mike Smith at that time was a young rider. Um, and so, we just did it sort of organically. We would tell these stories, we would interview people, and, like on the fly, you could say, "Hey, I can get Todd Pletcher right now. Do you want him?" And it would be a yes or a no. But I would say Fred Gaudelli came in and he changed all that. And at first, it was hard for me to, it was hard for all of us to adjust at first, because essentially it came in and went, "Okay, these are the stories we're going to tell, and this is how long you have to tell them. So Donna, you're going to talk about Superstock and the Asmussen family, and you've got 40 seconds to do it." Now, 40 seconds doesn't mean 45 seconds, and it doesn't mean 32. It means 40. And so now we had to start writing stories and like memorizing the stories. And, I'm not a paid actress. And so that was really quite an adjustment. And I almost didn't make it in my own mind. I never felt like I was on the verge of being fired, but it was really difficult for me to do, because I went from just, organically telling stories to scripting, essentially writing these stories like you. I mean, you've been a writer. So I had to become a writer and a storyteller. And then I had to become an actress, because I had to memorize the story and tell it to the camera. And so that was difficult for me at first. But what I think came out of it, and I think you've probably witnessed this, is that we do have a better telecast. We have a telecast that just goes like bam, 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 bam. You don't accidentally end up on an interview that's like dragging along and it's a channel changer and you can't get out of there. so we don't, we don't end up with stuff that the viewer's going to get bored by, and we just go fast. And I think that's what viewers have come to expect when they watch any sort of sports television. And also, if you watch the sitcoms, they just go from, one thing to another. It's like you can hardly keep up with it. So that's the main thing that has changed. And besides the fact that when I first started with NBC, we only covered the Derby, and it was a 2-hour show. And then we picked up the Oaks. And so now, coming into this year's Oaks and Derby, we're going to be on the air for 6 hours on Friday on Oaks Day and 5 hours on Saturday. So that's also changed. We have a whole lot more time to fill, and we have a bigger team. We probably have 10 people on the team now who are considered talent, who are out there telling stories, showing different perspectives. And the last thing I'm going to say is that I think it's important for people to understand, and especially people who are horse racing fans, because they get really angry with us sometimes, is that the Kentucky Derby is the only major sporting event that actually attracts more women than it does men. And it's only like about 51%. It's not a huge swing, but our demographic in the women is somewhere between 40 and 60 years old. And so, when you guys get angry with us because we've got Johnny Weir and Tara Lipinski on, it's not for the hardcore horse racing fans that we have them. We get that you don't love it, but you're not going to love everything we do, but the goal is that everybody will love something that we do. And so I think it's also shifted to that a bit, Christina.
Well, I think you make a wonderful point. And I think another thing that people don't always, maybe they might not think about it right away, is that as journalists, we're trying to find we're trying to find the nugget, we're trying to find something interesting to hook onto. And a lot of times, whether you're covering the sales or you're covering racing, it's a lot of the same people. So it's the same trainers, and it's the same, it's going to be Bob Baffert, it's going to, Todd Pletcher's going to be there. So then it comes up to the media to say, okay, well, let's delve a little bit deeper. Let's look beyond the immediate and what's the obvious thing. You know what I mean? So, and I'm sure you encounter that too, Donna. Sometimes, like with the Derby, you've got 20 horses, so it's fine. Like you've got a lot to work with. But some of the other races, sometimes it's probably a little bit challenging to find the nugget that's going to be like the really interesting thing.
It is, but we do have really good researchers at NBC, which helps a lot. Christina, when you were doing this all the time, you were your researcher, right?
Yes. Yes.
And so, I think one of the things that I definitely am grateful for is the print media, because without the turf riders, a lot of these stories wouldn't even be unveiled, because it's the turf riders who are out there at 5 a.m. in the morning, sort of, beating their feet on the backside, like trying to find those stories. And they find those stories, they write about them, and then we take them and go, we're going to tell this story to the national audience, right? We don't really come up with a lot of these stories. We depend on the turf riders to come up with those. Now, what we do is we tell them really well. And so, like the story again about Superstock and Steve's parents, because we're going to be able to do it in a 2-dimensional way instead of a 1-dimensional way. People are there can be 3-dimensional, but everybody else gets 1 or 2-dimensional. That's the best we can offer. So we get to tell the story because, like, again, we've got a camera crew in Laredo, Texas right now. We'll have camera crews here. We'll be following the family. And so we get to tell the story in a much more vibrant way. But essentially, those nuggets that we come up with come from the print media. And we just try to paint a beautiful picture with the nugget that we've got from you all.
Okay, definitely. Actually, Donna, we do have a question. Joe, I think you have your hand up if you want to ask your question.
I do. Hi, Donna. I'd like to know, I'd like you to tell us about the day Maximum Security won and then lost the Kentucky Derby. As I recall, I think that you did an interview with Luis Saez walking back to the winner's circle. I'd be very curious about your whole experience that day.
Yeah, it was definitely the most interesting Kentucky Derby I've ever covered. So I interviewed Luis Saez after the race, as I always do, pull up next to the winning rider. Now, one thing that we're not allowed to talk to the winning jockey if there's an objection or a claim of foul, any sort of an inquiry going on. And so if me or Luis Saez or the outrider who was holding on to Luis Saez and leading his horses, I was talking to him, had any idea that there had been, which there wasn't yet at that point, So if at any point during that interview, you know, a claim of foul had been lodged, and the outrider would have known about it right away, and he would have had to, you know, wrap on the interview. And so I really don't get to talk to the winning rider until, when you think about it, it seems like it's right after the race, but in reality, it's about 3 minutes after the race, maybe even 5. And so usually by the time I get to them, there's been plenty of time for there to be the inquiry, the objection, any sort of claim of fouls. And those claim of fouls are usually lodged on track. So the jockeys will ride up to one of the outriders and say, I'm going to lodge a claim of foul against the winner for interference at such and such a place. And the outrider will radio that information back to the stewards. None of that happened. So I interviewed Luis Saez as if he had won the Kentucky Derby. And Luis Saez talked to me as if he had won the Kentucky Derby. Now, he did allude to the fact in the interview, he did say something along the lines of, my horse stuck out a little, but you know, he's just young. He don't bother anybody though. And I just said, you know, did he shy away from, you know, something? And he said, yeah, but he didn't bother anybody. And so I went on with it because, again, no way to know what was going to happen. And so I do the interview and they start galloping back. And it's not until I get back that my production assistant said to me, there's going to be a claim of foul, because at that point they were showing the replay of that infraction that had happened at the top of the stretch on the infield boards or on the big screen at Churchill Downs. And I said, well, it's the Derby, it's not going to come down. And he said, I don't know, you might want to watch this one. Now, my production assistant's father is a valet at Belmont Park and has been for 50 years. And so my production assistant, Harry Rice, knows how to watch a race. And so I watched it and I was like, oh, wow, this has to come down. Like, there's no way this number can stay up. And so the 24-minute adjudication process that followed wasn't so much about, just so you know, from a different perspective too, wasn't so much about the stewards trying to make a decision. I think the decision was an easy decision. The horse has to come down. But what happened to take the claim of foul and the inquiry so long was that the stewards now needed to try to talk to some of those riders. And after the Derby, that's easier said than done. You've got so many riders. Some are still standing around talking to their connections. Some are signing autographs. Some are back in the jocks room in the shower. So they're trying to get those riders on the phone. And then beyond that, they're trying to figure out exactly how many horses he bothered. Because as you know, you've got to put him behind the horse that he bothered. But in this case, he bothered several. And so that whole 24-minute adjudication process was not about whether or not he comes down. It was about, let's talk to the riders and then where do we put him?
Thanks.
Excellent question. And that's a really interesting answer, because again, that's the stuff that we don't see. We don't see at home. We don't know about that. So that's really interesting.
Now, the stewards always talk with us. So when I say us, I don't mean me, but they talk with our, you know, Amy Zimmerman, Christina.
Yes.
Our associate producer, and she's in the truck with the main producer, Rob Hyland, and she'll be on the phone with the stewards at every track we're at. You know, is it an all clear? If there's an inquiry. In this case, the stewards stopped talking. And in Barbara Borden, there was a really good article in the Courier Journal just this past week from the chief steward, an interview with the chief steward, Barbara Borden, who finally talked about what happened. And the reason why she couldn't and none of the other stewards could talk about it before now was because there was still litigation. And so until the litigation was over, they really couldn't talk about it. And one of the things that they immediately were aware of is there's going to be litigation. This is the Kentucky Derby. There's no way this is going to happen without litigation. And so they just shut down and they didn't talk to us. And I think in hindsight, they wish that they would have maybe handled that just a little bit different, because they weren't telling us anything. So we couldn't tell the viewers anything. I mean, all we had was camera shots. And so anyway, we didn't know as much as we should have known, and as much as we'll know going forward. I don't think that whole scene will play itself back out again.
Well, we definitely hope not. Larry, I see that you have a question that you wanted to ask.
This is for Donna. We feel that Lois Green needs her 40 seconds of fame on NBC. For her, and Len, but Lois, because her contribution to the sport has been kind of overshadowed, and it's time for a woman of her stature to get the recognition that she needs for her contribution to horse racing, which has been considerable.
Larry, I missed who you said deserves the recognition. I missed the name.
Lois Green, so Leonard Green, they're running helium in the Derby this year. So Lois and Len, they have a horse running helium. That's who he said. And she's on the call. She's actually on the call right now.
Larry, here's the thing. I mean, honestly, when you dig into the owners and the breeders on every single Derby horse, there's a story, right? There's a story with all of them. And I wish we had time to tell all the stories. I mean, you would think that in 5 hours we would have time to tell all the stories, but we don't. And so, yeah, they like to, just keep the show moving from, one story to another. And again, we don't just have horse racing fans tuning in. The Kentucky Derby is a sporting event, but it's also become just an event. And so we have to just keep mixing it up with our content. I wish we could tell all the stories though, Larry.
All right, but all I'm saying is if helium does what he thinks we're gonna do, Lois needs some recognition.
Okay.
Okay.
I promise you, Lois will get a lot of recognition.
Yeah, if they win the Derby, they sure will. We have another question as well, Donna. We also have Chris. He's up as well. I think he's one of our new members. Chris, are you on there?
Yes, thank you. Good to be a part of the group. Good to be a part of the group. Donna, thank you for joining us. I was just curious, what is your all-time favorite Derby moment? And part two of that is, who is the most emotional jockey that you can remember you've ever interviewed after a win in that race?
Well, the most emotional is for sure Calvin Burrell, right? I mean, nobody's more emotional than him. I don't know if all of you were, some of you were watching when he won his first Kentucky Derby in 2007 with Street Sense, but it was a very emotional win for him with tears streaming down his face. And, I wish my mommy and daddy were here, and, went back and gave his brother a big hug. And so my two favorites, as far as from just being like emotional and not being afraid to talk about what's in their heart instead of getting into their head, or Calvin Burrell and Mike Smith, because Mike Smith also stays very much in his heart. He has a heart filled with gratitude for opportunities. And then when he has wins, it's even filled with more gratitude. And I'm going to be biased about my favorite Derby. And you're the first person that I've ever been able to answer this question. Normally, until last year, until this past Derby, I would have said I don't really have a favorite, because as a journalist, I don't have a rooting interest. But this past year changed that just a little bit, because my husband, Frank Brothers, is part of the bloodstock team that selected Authentic. And so my husband was a longtime horse trainer. He started training in 1979. He retired in 2009. And he never won the Kentucky Derby. He had a horse named Hansel, who was the favorite one year. Hansel didn't show up in the Derby, came back 2 weeks later, won the Preakness, won the Belmont Stakes. He had won the race before the Derby. And so I felt like, finally my husband got his Kentucky Derby win. And so admittedly, I was super happy after Authentic won, and what a weird year it was. So that would be my favorite.
Okay, great question. Actually, that was my first Derby that I went to, was that Derby, Donna. Was that Hansel, Strike the Gold. That was my first Derby that I actually physically went to, but that was pretty exciting. Great question. That's a great question. What about last year, Donna? Like, what was it like to be in that the whole COVID era? Just tell us a little bit about, because you also did the Breeders' Cup, obviously, too. So tell me a little bit, what was the year like?
Well, the Derby was really bizarre because, you go from 150,000 fans to 150 fans.
Yeah.
All we had was owners and connections there. So there was no crowd noise. You saw some people around, but when you look up to the grandstand, they were virtually empty. And so it was just really bizarre. But as you well know, winning the Kentucky Derby in those circumstances means no less to the winning connections. So from that standpoint, it was still just as meaningful for the trainer, owner, jockey, all the connections, as if they had won the Derby in front of 150,000 people. But this is a sport with fans, and we miss the fans. We love having the fans there. And so it was bizarre. The whole COVID year was bizarre, but it was for everybody. So, you know, one thing we do on the racetrack, Christine, and you've done it yourself, is we adjust on the fly. I mean, it's a live sport. It's happening outdoors, and they don't wait for, you know, you to pick up the cues to go with the flow. You go with the flow or you get left behind. And so I think, you know, horse racing was probably better equipped to just make adjustments on the fly than almost any other sport.
Well, between the Breeders' Cup and the Triple Crown races, we talked about maximum security. Was there another race between either of those two events or those races that was like the most, that you really had to go, you were on the fly, like it was the most maybe exciting, but also maybe the most challenging, and that you really had to switch gears really quickly and just, you know, just make, I don't know, just try to create something out of something that seems like a really chaotic situation?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, one of the sad ones was when 8 Bells broke down right after the Derby. And I was in position to interview not Big Brown, the horse, but the jockey, Keith DeSormo, Kent DeSormo, I'm sorry. And so I was in position, and she was actually galloping toward me, and I saw her break down on the racetrack, and Kent saw it, and, you know, the outrider was there. And so, you know, for Kent, I mean, first of all, you know, may she rest in peace. You know, you have a filly who's been valiant in her effort and in her defeat, finished second, and then break down on the racetrack. And then poor Kent just won the Kentucky Derby, and he too was, his emotion was flattened, you know, wind taken out of his sails. And so we had to make our way quietly and slowly past the horse that was on the track until they could get care to her. And then, you know, then do the interview, which was very subdued because of that. You know, same with Barbaro, when the Barbaro incident happened. But fortunately, those things are few and far in between. And I will tell you this, as a reporter on horseback, approaching the winning jockey right after a big race like the Kentucky Derby or Breeders' Cup or any of those classic races, the emotion that they have of joy and gratitude is so big that that aura of energy expands 6 feet in every direction. And you are immediately encompassed in that aura of energy. And as soon as you get there, you feel that gratitude, you feel the joy, you feel the elation, you feel all of it. And so, you know, I'm just grateful to be able to be in that position time and time again. But I guess probably the two most meaningful one. No, I would say the most meaningful one for me. And when I say meaningful, I just mean like I could still cry thinking about it. Was, you know, we all waited 37 years for that Triple Crown. And so talking to Victor Espinoza and being there after he won the Triple Crown after a 37-year drought, that was pretty special. And to be able to be, you know, right there. And American Pharoah was such a great horse. And then when he came back and won the Breeders' Cup Classic and beat, you know, not just the horses of his generation, but the older ones too, at Keeneland, you know, the breeding ground of horse racing, essentially, was a really special moment also.
That was a great story. It's true. I was there. I was very blessed that I went to all three of the Triple Crown races that year with American Pharoah. And it was like we were hugging people next to us, like high-fiving. We didn't even know the people around us, and everybody was, this is pre-COVID, people, so obviously we were, you know, everybody, but it was like amazing. You're right. It was one of the best experiences, I think, my racing career was just being there.
I wasn't in the grandstand, obviously, because I was on a horse, but from
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Other people, like, you could literally feel the stands shake. Yes.
Shake. Yeah. Yeah, it was tremendous. But, you know, you do such a great job, Donna. We've been watching you for so many years. Honestly, we really appreciate all the information and everything you guys do for us. And we really, really appreciate you coming on. Before we let you go, I just want to know, have you chosen who your Derby horse is going to be, or are we still pondering that?
Well, you know, I have a feeling, much like what I heard Mike Welsh there at the end, I have a feeling all the wise guys are going to pick against Essential Quality because they want to beat the favorite. And so I think he's going to be a higher price favorite than he should be. And so I'll take a higher price favorite than he should be when he's a 5 for 5 undefeated horse. I can forgive his last race having been narrowly, winning narrowly over highly motivated. It was his second start off of a layoff. He had started in November and then hadn't started again for a few months. And I think it was a big effort off the layoff. And so he probably stood to, as we say, bounce a little bit. So that second effort was probably a little bit of a regression of his form. And even though it was a hard fought win, I don't think it was his best effort. And everybody in this race that he's faced, he's beat, and he can do it any number of ways. He can come from dead last, he can lay mid-pack, he can go to the lead. And wouldn't it be a great story for Luis Saez to finally get that Derby win? And then look at all the good things that Godolphin, Sheikh Mohammed has done for horse racing, between the Godolphin Flying Start program for young people coming up in our industry, and then also the big aftercare program that they have. So I think that would be not just a good story, but I think it's gonna be hard to beat Essential Quality. He finds a way to win. The horse I like for a price right now is Midnight Bourbon, because first of all, I like his progression. I had his past performances pulled up here earlier. How I talked to Steve about this the other day, how he managed to run a 37 first time out, I have no idea. But I mean, every single one of his buyer numbers have been just incrementally, just a little bit better. And I really like that kind of progression on a horse. And no fault in any of the other jockeys, but any of those jockeys, and then to Mike Smith, that's a big jockey change. And Mike Smith knows how to win the Kentucky Derby. He knows how to win these kind of races. And I just like the way this horse is training, and I like him in the bottom of my exacta.
Okay, great. Okay, that's a great, we have one of our members, I don't know if they have a question for Donna or they accidentally unmuted. Neil, are you on there? Did you want to ask Donna a question? No, maybe not. I think maybe they just did accidentally. Well, Donna, thank you so much again for joining us. We really appreciate it. We hope that you come back on at some point, because we just loved having you on.
Well, Christine, it was my pleasure, and Empire Club, good to talk to you all, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon. Happy Derby.
Okay, happy Derby to you too.